What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds each and every single day for the past 114 days. And in today's video, we're going to be going through the hidden system that drives buying decisions. We're going to be going through why testimonials are under leveraged and how to create leverage from that as well. And also thinking about testimonials in terms of systems, basically inputs, processing, and outputs, and also treating testimonials as operational levers, how to basically pull these different levers in different scenarios, and also why this matters long term, as well as building the testimonial system. So this is going to be a fun one, super tactical as well, but ultimately going to provide as much value as possible. So how to basically think about systems is how the right testimonials architect or basically are architected ultimately amplifies trust, authority, and decision making in ways most businesses never think about. And the goal for this video is ultimately to bring a new perspective and a new angle to basically look at testimonials and how to pull these different levers. So if we go why testimonials are under leverage, it's simply because most businesses treat testimonials as static proof of trust, basically thinking that, hey, here's a happy customer and this person has tried out our product and ultimately you should try it too. But the underlying issue here is that testimonials are passive. They're not structured as systems with cascading effects. And what this ultimately means is, how can you build these systems or this testimonial into a system that ultimately purchases or pushes the buyer that wants to buy this specific product or service into making that decision, ultimately bridging whether it's trust, whether it's fear of missing out, and also just to accelerate their buying decision as well. It ultimately comes down to structuring this in that specific manner and not just posting it in a in a way that, hey, here's your happy customer and simply that is the end of it, because that ultimately means that a single testimonial is equal to 1 point of influence, and what you ultimately want to do is create multiple points of influence that hit at different angles. And we're going to dive a lot deeper into that in terms of what these different angles are, and also understanding for what specific stage these use cases would be perfect for, and also understanding that the missing leverage is within the sequence, context, integration, and integration into the decision making journey. Because one of the most important things is ultimately to contextualize what specific stage and also integrating that specific stage into the buying decision. So what specific stage are you targeting, in terms of, are you targeting someone that is super early, which you then need to focus a lot more on the trust angle in terms of the testimonials that you would be showing to them, because there's going to be a lot of skepticism and you want to make sure that they feel welcome, like, hey, it's safe over here, which we're going to dive into a lot deeper into as we go. But ultimately contextualizing and also making sure that we're hitting within the specific sequence, that we need to make sure that we're also ultimately getting the buyer to make the decision for the specific stage that they're at. And also understanding that this ultimately means us creating leverage within testimonials, because I think testimonials are one of the things that are under leveraged or underused as leveraged within businesses. And that's why I ultimately made this video in terms of how I'm thinking about it as well. So how can we then ask the question of, how do we then think of testimonials as systems? You think of testimonials as this one thing, a video, text, or something that basically someone shows what it feels like or what it is to be within your system. So then the question then becomes, how do you then basically think of testimonials as systems? And this ultimately comes down to a result of thinking about it in inputs, process, and outputs, with the inputs being the raw customer stories slash feedback that you get from your users, where you basically collect strategically and also focus on the outcomes, metrics, and transformations, basically seeing what are the outcomes that this specific specific individual faced while being within our ecosystem, what are the metrics that they ultimately had, what are the things that we can tangibly show people that, hey, they got this specific results, whether it's cash flow or even just transformation. If you think about it in body transformation, from this is how this specific person looked 6 months ago, and this is how they look 12 months later, and that ultimately comes down to the transformation as well. How were they at their past states and now into their current states? What has changed and how has it changed from them being within your system? And also being able to segment by persona. So basically different people have different personas. So let's say it's a stay-at-home mom, or that specific stay-at-home mom would ultimately need to be segmented into that specific persona, where you have other people that are like-minded or are in a similar state that ultimately need to be tailored to that specific client persona. And also the pain point and also decision stage. So yeah, so basically segmenting on different personas, pain points. So what are the specific pain points that they're facing, and also understanding that, as well as the decision stage. What point on the decision ladder are they on, so that we can ultimately then use that to tailor how we basically structure out the testimonials that we're then showing in front of them. And then we can think about it in terms of the processing layer, where we basically structure and amplify, where we're not just focusing on just posting these testimonials just for the sake of posting, but we're rather structuring them in a manner that ultimately amplifies their impact. And what this means is basically narratively structuring them, or structuring them specifically on a narrative. And you can structure this on the narrative of saying, hey, here's the problem and here's the solution that we have, or that we have created and helped this specific individual, and this is the transformation that they've ultimately faced as a result of being within our environment or our ecosystem. And this is the quantified impact, which ultimately ties back to the metrics side of it, where we say that one of the most important things is ultimately to quantify the impact, because people feel the quantity of the impact when they actually see, like saying, hey, we've generated $20,000 for this specific person. If you're then able to quantify the level of impact that you've had, that ultimately hits on that, hey, if I see this specific person has transformed from this stage to this stage with this quantifiable impact, then I will be more likely to buy. But that ultimately means that we need to make sure that we're structuring it in the narrative, and not just placing it, or just basically saying, hey, we're just gonna take whatever structure this person takes us or gives us, and we're just gonna put it out there. But it's about strategically making sure that we're placing it in a narrative format. And this means we're identifying the problem, and we're showcasing the problem, and we're showcasing the solution as well. Because most of the times, from my experience, at least what I've seen, is that people jump from from problem to quantified impact, not necessarily taking the stage of doing this process loop where you go problem, solution, transformation, because you lose so much simply by the solution phase and also the transformation as well, because people need to see what it is that you're actively bringing into their lives, if you're going to be working, if they're going to be working with you. And also strategic placement of these. It's all about the structure and the amplification for it. So strategically placing it in funnels. So basically in your funnel, you can have it at the top or at the bottom, just making sure that you're strategically placing it in a place where that they will see it and they'll be able to not miss it. And also understanding that you're placing it somewhere within your website that they're able to then capture their attention, that you're then able to capture their attention as well. And also in video content, so how you basically showcasing these testimonials in your video content. Are you showing it before? Are you showing it after? All these little things matter. And also understanding where you also placing it within your sales pages or sales decks. If you're making it one of the most prominent thing, then ultimately you're going to make sure that the prospective clients that are going to be working with you see it, and that ultimately matters. And this also means that you can have it in multi-format, where video, text, audio, and social post. I've seen in my personal experience that video works the best in this specific use case, that video formats, because they actually see the person and they understand what this person is saying, rather than the text, because anyone can just make a text, but not everyone can make a video specifically from the business owner themselves. themselves. And that ultimately leads us to the outputs. And this is where all the leverage, in my opinion, ultimately gets created. This is where the source of it is, which ultimately leads to the output, where you ultimately hit on the influence levers that are activated through this. And what I mean by this is that trust is obviously, a guarantee in this specific stage, that you build trust and that you reduce decision speed. So you ultimately, reduce the friction. They don't ask why, simply because you've taken them through that stage of pre-selling them, and that ultimately reduces that friction as well. And also social proof loops, because others emulate buyers behavior, so they're ultimately gonna understand, hey, this person has done this specific step, let me also do that. And that ultimately leads you to emulate the buyer behavior. So you basically, making sure that you're leveraging social proof as well, because people buy from people at the end of the day. And also understanding that, we also need to hit on the authority signal, where the testimonial shows that, the high value clients endorse your methods, that they are an active advocate for your specific way of doing things. And that ultimately matters, as well as hitting the emotional resonance, basically connecting on a story level, because people love stories. Everyone loves a good story. One of the biggest brands, or the biggest brands, always have a story that ultimately encompasses how they ultimately operate and also function. So why not use that as leverage? Because everyone has a story, and most people, from my experience, also buy from stories. They buy from people, but they also buy the story of that specific person, and not just facts. If I just come to you and I dump a bunch of random facts to say, hey, there's 7 billion people in this world, there's a bunch of numbers, yes, it would sound great, but are you most gonna connect with that? Or are you gonna connect with someone that spits the facts or shows the facts, but then also tells a story behind those facts? Because from my experience, I've seen so many people buy from people that tell stories rather than just spewing a bunch of facts, because people get tired of that, and they ultimately want to know that they're being trusted, or they're trusting into a process, and they trust the story and the vision as well. And that ultimately means we're also needing to hit on the learning and meta feedback, where new clients learn what success looks like within your system. And I've already tapped on this a little bit, on what the active outcome would be and what ultimately comes as a result of these prospective clients being within your ecosystem. And that is one of the most important leverage points to ultimately hit as well. But then if we dive a lot deeper, we can look at how this looks in a structured format flow, where we have your inputs, basically your raw customer success slash feedbacks that you ultimately get, and you get your processing, where you basically structure and amplify these testimonials as well. But then you also get your outputs, where your influence levers are activated, where you basically dive a lot deeper, and then you understand where the trust signals are, or even just the different decision speeds, social proof loops, authority signals, emotional resonance, and also learning and meta feedback as well, that you're making sure that you're hitting on those specific outputs. And not only that, but you're also making sure that you're running feedback loops. You're testing what's happening, you're tracking the data as well, you're understanding what works, what doesn't work, because ultimately this needs to be run through feedback loops, which ultimately allow you to then optimize. And through this optimization, then you're able to find what works and what doesn't work, and you can tweak it as well. But that ultimately covers that specific segment of thinking of testimonials as a system. But now we can dive into how testimonials act as an operational lever. How do you ultimately have a testimonial, and how do you structure it in a format that acts as an operational lever? Well, this is because testimonials are signal multipliers, which tell prospective buyers and competitors who you serve, how you operate, and how you position yourself within the market. And this is super important, because if you're showing testimonials to a person that is early stage, then you want to be focusing on trust building. This is basically saying, hey, you're safe within this ecosystem, you're home, you're basically building trust with that specific prospective client, and you're focusing on testimonials that ultimately convey that message of trust. If you're focusing on someone that is late stage, but you ultimately giving them testimonials that focus on early stage, that is ultimately not going to land as hard if you're targeting that specific segment. And understanding which specific stage your buyers and clients are, that ultimately ultimately matters a lot, because if they're mid stage, for example, you hit on scarcity slash outcome signaling, which basically means that you're saying, hey, there are other people that are, like you, so come and join within our ecosystem. And you're just pushing out testimonials that ultimately hit on that specific front to say, hey, there's so many other people that are like you, they already trust you, there's so many other people that are like you, so why not just, just basically just get within this specific ecosystem or product or service that we're selling. And also understanding that, people that are in the late stage, they ultimately just need acceleration and decision making triggers. So basically saying, hey, we only have a few spots left, we only have this and this and this. We are making sure that we're accelerating the decision making process by making sure that we're just hitting on that specific front in terms of testimonials to say, hey, I grew this in this specific timeline, and if you want to join, then there's only a limited amount of time. And thinking about this in different segments is ultimately what ultimately builds this testimonial as a system, and dives a lot deeper into building these operational levers. Because if you're just posting testimonials just for the sake of posting and saying, hey, like, this is just a buyer, this person's gonna buy from me because I'm posting these testimonials, but not structuring them in a manner that ultimately amplifies them and also hits the intended target, then you're ultimately not gonna resonate, or they're not gonna resonate with the message as much as they should. But that ultimately means that you can also engineer persuasion triggers that ultimately are super targeted on personas, outcome specific, and timing as well. Specific in the buyer journey, so people that are late in the buyer journey need an accelerant, so that you posting testimonials that ultimately get them to make that decision today rather than later. And also understanding that if they're in the middle, that you're pushing those testimonials that focus a lot more on the outcomes, so are outcome specific, and also make sure that they understand this is the specific outcome that they're gonna get, and also targeting the personas. Because if you're then able to make a testimonial that is about saving money versus one that is about saving or scaling revenue, that would make sure, or that will ultimately mean that you're using two different buyer objections, so that you're hitting on two different buyer objections, and that you're ultimately making sure that what it is that you're positioning to them and use of your testimonials is ultimately landing with your prospective client. And you're not just shooting blind, but you're being more laser focused, because a laser, if you look at how a laser ultimately functions, if it points at one specific spot, it's ultimately going to focus in all its energy on that specific spot, rather than if you just cast a light or a light beam, it's going to cast in so many different directions, and it might hit some people, but it's not going to be as super tailored and focused as much as it should be. And it's all just about pushing those different operational levers that ultimately get you the results that you're intending for. Because I think there's a lot of leverage within testimonials that ultimately can be built up and also used as leverage within your specific business. Because I think not a lot of people probably think about the power of testimonials and structuring them in a manner that ultimately amplifies their impact as well. And that ultimately means that you need to make sure that you're testing testimonial formats, content, and placement to measure conversion lift, to make sure that, hey, you're ultimately understanding the metrics. And as much as these may be nice to haves, we need to make sure that we're understanding the metrics in terms of how these systems are making sure that they're operating within our specific use case, and that you're treating them as systems rather than decorations. Because if you're treating testimonials as systems, they're ultimately gonna work. Sure, in the beginning it may be slow and you may not be able to track as much in the beginning or see as much result, but ultimately over a long period of time it's gonna compound. And one of those small tweaks is ultimately gonna push in a lot of revenue, simply because you understand what specific stage that the buyers are in, and also what specific testimonials to use for this specific persona, outcome, and also making sure that the timing as well, what specific stage are they at as well. because all these small things ultimately do make a difference in my opinion, and this ultimately matters long term. And how this matters long term is that, standard testimonials equals commodity. Anyone can, just bring up a testimonial and just make it, but ultimately understanding that systemized testimonials equals differentiation modes, that you're taking a different approach, but you're basically, systemizing these testimonials and making sure that they're more structured and optimized to your testimonial system, and making sure that you're building structure around this, because you need less to sell verbally, and you need faster conversions and higher perceived expertise, as well as compounds your influence over time. And these are the things that you can expect simply from doing this simple, or thinking about it in terms of systems. Because one of the things is, you don't have to focus so much on selling verbally, simply because your testimonials hit their specific pain point and outcome specific as well for this specific stage and timing as well, which is super important, because then you can just use this loop that ultimately runs, this systemized testimonial framework, that or network, that ultimately allows you to scale the level of impact that you have simply through testimonials. Because I think testimonials are one of those things that, are under leveraged, and there's a lot more leverage to be built around them. It's just all about structuring them and thinking about them in terms of inputs, processes, and outputs, and how those outputs all relate to each other, which ultimately builds this mode of building the testimonial as a system. But this ultimately means that you can use this to basically collect internally by segmentation, by problem, outcome, or persona, like I just mentioned, process strategically by story plus format plus placement within the buyer journey, also amplify intelligently by multiple channels, sequence delivery, and data feedback. So all the data that you are ultimately getting from this, as well as the multiple channels that you may be using for these specific testimonials, and also gathering those data, because that ultimately means that you're hitting on all fronts, as well as the sequenced delivery. So basically understanding which specific sequence that they are in and delivering for that specific sequence. So whether it's early stage where you need a lot of trust, or mid stage where you need to focus a lot more on trust, or even the late stage where you'd rather focus a lot more on accelerating the decision. And through these testimonials, they all serve different purposes, but it's just more so thinking about testimonials in a much more strategic manner, that ultimately allows you to iterate continuously by tracking which testimonials move metrics, and ultimately refining the system. Because in as much as you can just post a testimonial, it's much better to just have a structure that you ultimately are having these testimonials, because more structure equals more clarity, and that clarity tied in, or hand in hand with metrics such as data as well, is ultimately going to move the needle for your specific business. But that ultimately means that you run this loop where you basically collect, and then you process, and then you amplify, and then you iterate, and then you just repeat the whole entire cycle, where you collect the data, you collect what it is that you need to be doing by segmentation, by problem, outcome, or persona, and then ultimately process, where you basically strategically doing it by story plus format in this specific instance, and also making sure that you're placing it right within the buyer journey, and then amplifying this through intelligently delivering through multiple channels, sequence delivery, and data feedback as well. And then iterating, where you basically constantly, like I said, constantly track which testimonials move metrics, and then refine the system, and then just repeat the loop. And this is ultimately the process in which the hidden system that drives buying decisions. This is my own personal take on it, and how I'm actively thinking about it and implementing it, as well of thinking it more in terms of a structured format, and seeing the hidden leverage that ultimately powers testimonials. Because I believe there's so much leverage within testimonials that can be utilized for business use cases, and it's all just about thinking about it more strategically, thinking about it more tactically, and how can we create more leverage within these specific testimonials that ultimately drives the business forward, rather than just posting a testimonial and saying, hey, we have this proof, but we're not even super tailoring it to the specific segmentation. Basically, the different segment that there are they early stage, mid stage, or late stage. We're just posting it, but we're not really understanding, who we're targeting and the persona as well. Just having a more structured format in terms of the system of testimonials. So yeah, like I said, this is my own personal take on it. This is how I'm thinking about this, and this is how I'm also going to be implementing it into the future. So we're going to be running a bunch of different tests on this, making sure that we're just constantly refining the system each and every single day. Today I added a ton of diagrams, so if you guys see the diagrams, just let me know if that's something that I should incorporate a lot more into these daily videos, and I will definitely do that. So yeah, if you guys like to connect with me, check out the newsletters, the first link in the description, or connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. Links are also just below that as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed this video. Make sure to connect with me. Like I said, check out the newsletter, and I will see you guys in the next video.